Hey there, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today we finally have from Geese Getting Killed. Hey, can you tell that I've been procrastinating with this one? Now, to be fair to myself, this album did come out 2 days before I got married. I was just a little bit busy, and I did the exact same thing with 3D Country, an album I liked and found somewhat intriguing for all its unkempt, shaggy weirdness a few years ago, but have barely revisited since, which is exactly what I said in my late review of said project. But it became very clear that I was falling out of step with the larger indie zeitgeist. First, there was heavy metal, Cameron Winter's solo release in December 2024, which won a ton of critical acclaim and made a whole lot of 2025 year-end lists from a lot of critics who typically take that month off, calendar year of eligibility be damned. And to provide my quick thoughts there, okay, look, the make or break point is Cameron Winter's warbling nasal performance and whether or not you can tolerate his Julian Casablancas or Will Toledo on Lean by way of Tom York mewling by way of Kermit the Frog. And even then, that doesn't quite align with what he's trying to sound like. It's really quite bizarre how much he reminds me of someone that I just can't quite pin down. But I think where he kind of lost me proper was in the songwriting, which was supposed to pop against this ramshackle, semi-kooky curdle of throwback singer-songwriter production as he just prostrates his angst and urges, and I'm sorry, I'm just not all that impressed. I know that all performance is affectation on some level. It doesn't normally sound like that, and I get why someone like Nick Cave would co-sign this, as he shares a similar crude clarity in his most atomized guttural moments, which will be perceived as most human by the majority of folks. But there's also something very coy, guarded, and self-impressed in how Cameron Winter describes his art in a lot of interviews, that once you've gone through this atom of emotion, I don't know, for me as a whole, it didn't quite coalesce. Now look, it can still work. Art reflecting the human experience necessarily doesn't always come together or make sense or coalesce. And if all sounds kind of cool anyway, who the hell cares? Especially in a live environment when it's all about that centralized magnetism that will be perceived as honest for its eccentricity for the majority of folks. Where I find it painfully ironic, the other comparison I made with 3D Country is to the Red Hot Chili Peppers, a band that Nick Cave can't stand. And it's that wavering line where it's supposed to build up to more, especially in the broader context of more challenging and thought-provoking experimental rock and art. It's kind of left me still on the fence. But that was before Getting Killed became one of the biggest indie rock smashes of this year, produced by Kenneth Bloom, aka formerly Kenny Beats of all people, also dominating all those year-end lists released early and winning over huge audiences for the Electric Live Show, which again, doesn't remotely surprise me. We'll get into more of that later. And I figured this would finally be the best possible point to get properly on board. And what do you know? Getting Killed leaves me even more conflicted, frustrated that I absolutely grasp the appeal of this album. I get why it's so big, but I'm also convinced that it's doing both more and less than it thinks it is. Down to the album art staring into the sun as a hazy figure wields both trumpet and gun. How angelic of it all. And I think I gotta start there, because I will give Cameron Winter the benefit of the doubt that he's found a voice that speaks to something raw and unwieldy across this album. I can kind of get into it. That there is some genuine sincerity in the shaggy emotions that are on display, a lot of which feel like getting crushed underfoot. Pun only partially intended, if you know, you know. But building off of the quasi-surreal imagery coming from earlier albums, Winter is adept in describing paranoia and a lot of crushing loneliness, clinging to whatever fragile power he might have, even as it all seems to be constantly slipping through his fingers. To make another very on-the-nose Nick Cave comparison, it's always very striking how little the protagonists of the music were actually satiated. They get what they want, or without any sort of dire consequences. And even if a song like Husbands engages in all the metatext of never fully explaining himself in the journey of creating art, it is a method of control that he seems to know is at least partially doomed to fail in the long term. If you're letting it all out and being so confessional and vulnerable, people will eventually figure out the truth. And credit to Cameron Winter and the band. If we're looking for a thematic core as to why Geese's music has such resonance to a much larger, younger demographic, the struggle in feeling like you've got no real control over your life, and it's a desperate struggle to assert any of it, yeah, completely understandable. And at this album's best, you can see that shared sense of empathy, or at least where the chords feel a little bit more resonant overall. Like, I like the dissonant paranoia split across the squealing guitars and blast of trombone on the opener Trinidad, where it reflects someone getting ground down and then used where you can barely even tell your own senses. You question them, echoed by the hollers, with guest vocals from JPEG Mafia of all people, of there being a bomb in his car. Doesn't even matter if the bomb's real or not. If he fully believes that it is and has to get away from it all at all cost, well, the emotion is there. And while I've already mentioned Husbands as a very early highlight with one of the album's best hooks, as all the choral harmonies build over that sandy, stumbling groove, I really appreciate how it flows into the meta text that comes on the title track right after it, with the careening guitar jangle and the tempo-bending pileup of a groove, and how despite all of his own angst and struggle, there is an overwhelming feeling of guilt and thinking that it's not really all that bad for him compared to some of the others that might be in the audience. And that empathy translates extremely well into Islands of Man, as its very deliberate watery tap alongside the steady guitar lick and the lumbering bounce of that groove, not just in highlighting a very distinctly masculine socialized loneliness, but also for the closeted trans woman that they're singing about. Made all the worse by pushing their identity down from within. They want her to know there's still time. And I'll give the band, and specifically their guitarist Emily Green, for interweaving some of that nascent trans subtext. A queer reading of this album is absolutely possible and would be kind of fascinating. And while the frenetic chug of the boogie on 100 Horses further amplifies some of the experimental factors, where in wartime people are just pressed towards entertainment or escape or distraction rather than actually deal with the trauma they're facing, there is another side to that empathy, where I can't help but feel like Cameron Winter's writing turns inwards to more relationship subject matter, and at least for me lands more clumsily. Now again, that can feel very real. I gotta keep reminding myself that this is a band predominantly in their early 20s, where the wispy yet seedy entreaties of Cobra are interwoven with a fat bass line with the imagery of a snake charmer, to where describing love on the stuttering faux psychedelic twang with a genuinely great melodic core of Half Real almost has him craving a lobotomy to get out of his own head for both the peaks and valleys. But there's a hard swerve on the drippy and ramshackle Pays du Cocaine that isn't just a sloppily translated reference for an escape to paradise, but also a plea for this partner to stick around even if they're changing. Don't abandon him to that loneliness, even if he kind of knows that's going to be inevitable. It's an adolescent view of how one treats somebody in a relationship, which feels honest and maybe even age-appropriate in a certain way, but it's also where the self-awareness of Cameron Winter and Geese begins to overtangle itself in the triptych that ends off the album. Stuff filled with biblical metaphor encircling the struggle of creating this honest and true masterwork, the metatext crashing back in, the give and take of relationships that can be easily extrapolated to that with him and his muse, and it becomes a desperate attempt to seize some kind of control in and out the process. There is some truth in the jagged shuffle of Bow Down that he doesn't fully know what it's like to actually give in, being in a relationship or life or seeking an artistic ideal, and he will not be subordinate. He will refuse to pay the taxes, buy in. He can break his own goddamn heart. And against the history of rock and roll and God and the saints around him, he's gonna charge forth in this uncoordinated final rush, and damn you all if you think you can stop him. And there is a thrill in that defiance. The closer is impactful. Now, Cameron Winter has admitted in interviews he's got a pretty big ego, and the album's art certainly bends in the direction of a lot of that egotism. It's why the framing of his struggles on this album, especially around women, that navel-gazing feels a little awkwardly juxtaposed against moments of deeper empathy with that audience. But if you're possessed of the courage to think you can write yourself into rock history and then frame it as if the world and the heavens and everything else are against you, the album becomes an argument for its own success. Another reason I think it can inspire such resonance in an audience that might feel bereft of control or power. This is a way to live out that fantasy. But that ambiguous lens is not just constructed by Cameron Winter or Geese alone. And they gotta know that by this point. He might scoff at the music publications that overwrite and oversell a band's influence in some of those interviews, but the breathless critical acclaim is doing that for Geese anyway, with a distinctly New York self-serving state of mind, where of course the final song has him rolling back to Long Island City, and notably references Buddy Holly and the day the music died. I'm not gonna make too much of Cameron Winter's prep school background or any larger conversation of privilege, but not only did he himself reference it in passing on the title track in the awkward guilt that Winter feels, I'm also not ignoring the paratext of this album's acclaim amidst the historical subset of New York independent acts that utilize the city and its immense cultural cachet and writers to inflate their momentum past their substance. Vampire Weekend did that. LCD Sound System did that. The Strokes did that. And this sort of advantage compounds. The New York City indie complex reinforces itself as the most important music of the moment in the world, and then writes its own history to justify it. Very much analogous to what a lot of New York hip-hop does. And just like my occasional reticence there, especially to the big mainstream stuff, more than a few times I'm just not convinced the material is sharp enough to back up the bravado, no matter how self-aware Geese are about it. It's why, despite one of the best hooks off the tumbling drums that breaks towards the shimmering indie guitar line that feels imported straight from the Strokes, Taxes hits a weird note for me, because the middle finger at the system, it could be read as much right-wing libertarian as it is left-wing progressive against the modern authoritarians in the United States, where the emotional response, that's gonna be real and shared, but the sentiment selling it can feel purposefully a bit oblique. And for what purpose, I might add. And this isn't new coming from me either. I said this about 3D Country. How much the self-awareness and irony could excuse was less flattering text and all of the genre implications. And while the emotional core has been deepened on this album to reflect a little bit more unique experimentation, it does expose some new flaws along the way, none of which is amplified by hooks that, quite frankly for me, still should be way more melodically potent than they are. The grooves have a lot of texture, but I wish the tunes were stronger. And it's that conflict mirrored across both Getting Killed and the discourse around Geese that kind of bothers me, centering the ego-driven individualist will to power to make great art, push against systems and the emotions that might crush you underfoot, which if you indeed have talent, you're gonna need to do that. I'm not denying it. But those systems, that collective power and press and momentum and fandom, it's already somewhat in Geese's corner, despite it being framed as oppositional on the album. And it winds up not feeling nearly as revolutionary as it was hyped up to be, beyond the fact that other bands have done similar sounds. There are signals of empathy and disavowal of bad forces that would beat down their audience, but look behind the curtain, and it's considerably muddier in that conviction beyond their own appetites. And it's why Cameron Winter's performative style falls very near the uncanny valley for me in trying to be so raw and authentic. Yeah, dude, I've heard it before. Past 20 years. And truthfully, the majority of this is not Cameron Winter or the rest of Geese's fault. I think he's as thoroughly exasperated with the click-driven hype train as anyone. In many an interview, he's been willing to take the piss out of all of it. And I think at least he knows that he's trying to be sincere and authentic in all of it. It's categorically unfair on my part to put it all on them. And at least part of my reticence is also driven off of an understanding of why Getting Killed works for its audience and has received so much critical acclaim. Such to the point where this review is not going to change anything anything about that, keep that in mind in the comments. But again, I don't always love the deeper reasons as to why it's gotten as big as it has. But again, judging the album we got, trying to filter out as much of the paratext and legacy conversation, I mean, it takes bigger and more textured swings than 3D Country. It's a very good and at points a deeply fascinating album to explore. I completely understand why it's done so well, appealing to a lot of critics, but it's got steeper lows, and the more jam-focused structure of a lot of these songs often get in the way of their best hooks, another consistent problem, which given Winter's self-professed trajectory, I don't see that changing anytime soon, which is worrying. So while I do think I would seek out more of these individual songs in the future, I'm still lukewarm on the album as a whole, but I remain a little intrigued. If this is what Getting Killed sounds like, the revival could be truly special. I don't know. We'll have to see. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you want to see more, please be sure to like, share, drop comments, subscribe. Yes, I know this review is going to be controversial. I get why. Being as critical as I am with Geese, especially given all the critical acclaim and year-end list, is going to attract attention. Look, the album's good. I just don't think it's nearly as good as many set it out to be. Although I do think that self-confessed, not quite parody of itself, but that self-awareness that bleeds over to genre criticism, I think if I want to find the album that did this way better, it's Elvi's Return to the Moon from 2015, which also has its self-possessed pot shots taken at critics or a larger independent audience. But I just think Matt Berninger is a way sharper writer, and the hooks were stronger, and you get the gruesome Menemina, they're going to be really impotent there. And I think it was honestly just as experimental and slept on at the time. Also, it was a very similar breakup arc at the end, and I think that's worth highlighting as well. If you haven't heard that album in a while, please go check it out. But hey, leave your comments down there below. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if y'all want to get involved in getting projects on my schedule, or hell, actually that's going to be for January. If you want to help support the channel, or just yell at me on my Discord, or potentially see some new year-end lists early in the weeks ahead, well, stay tuned for that. But on my Patreon and YouTube memberships is right over there. Those are the links. Once again, don't feel obligated. Tough times, recession's likely coming. Stay tuned for that. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.